Certified case files. Genuine evidence. Objective truth. You are viewing Bodycam incident reports.
A guy rolling around in the dirt all day driving a 150 grand Escalade, put the keys on the hood. Those things can be cloned. I said step back.
If you open that car door without a warrant, it stops being a misunderstanding.
At 6:30 p.m., the skeletal steel frame of the New Valley Medical Center cast long, heavy shadows across the staging area. The roar of the diesel generators was fading, leaving a chalky layer of concrete dust in the air. David Clark walked out of the active Phase 2 zone, his shoulders aching with the deep exhaustion of a 14-hour shift. He was 48 years old. On paper, he was the man whose signature released 8-figure wire transfers and finalized municipal zoning permits. But when a massive foundation pour was scheduled, he was on the ground. Today he looked the part. He wore heavy-duty work jeans coated in pale gray cement dust, caked steel-toed boots, and a stained high-visibility vest over a sweat-ringed Henley. In his calloused hand, he loosely carried a scratched white hard hat. He walked past the main perimeter gate. Inside the reinforced booth, the night shift guard, Stan, gave him a familiar, tired nod. High above the booth, the red LED of a commercial PTZ security camera silently tracked David's movement as he stepped out onto the executive parking tier. Before we see how this confrontation shattered a career, drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know down in the comments. What city are you watching this from? The VIP lot was a small, cordoned-off section of fresh pavement, completely empty except for a single vehicle parked under a halogen light tower. It was a pristine, matte black, 2024 Cadillac Escalade V Series. The $150,000 luxury SUV stood in stark contrast to the industrial mud and heavy machinery surrounding it. David let out a heavy exhale. He reached into the front pocket of his dusty jeans and pulled out the heavy leather-bound electronic key fob. He pressed his thumb against the unlock button. The Escalade chirped twice. The LED headlights swept a crisp beam across the concrete, and the motorized running boards quietly deployed. David took the final 2 steps, reaching out. His fingers wrapped around the matte black door handle. He never pulled it. Without a siren, a white and black Ford Police Interceptor tore around the access road. The cruiser aggressively jumped the low concrete apron, bottoming out with a loud metallic scrape. It slammed its heavy steel push bumper directly into the path of the Escalade, trapping the SUV in its space. Instantly, the blinding strobe of red and blue light bars erupted, washing over the matte black paint and illuminating every particle of concrete dust clinging to David's clothes. The cruiser's million candle power spotlight clicked on, hitting David dead in the face, freezing him in place with his hand still resting on the door. The million candle power spotlight from the driver's side A-pillar of the Ford Interceptor cut through the settling concrete dust like a solid white column of light. It pinned David Clark against the matte black door of the Escalade. David instinctively raised his left forearm, the one loosely gripping the scratched white hard hat, to shield his eyes from the heat of the glare. The driver's side door of the Interceptor kicked open before the vehicle's suspension had fully settled from its aggressive curb jump. Officer Wilson stepped out into the harsh, strobing wash of red and blue LED light bars. He was in his late 20s, his dark uniform pulling tight across his chest. His right hand instantly dropped to his waist. His thick black tactical glove came to rest deliberately over the retention hood of his holstered sidearm. "Step back from the vehicle," Wilson barked. The command didn't just carry volume, it carried the raw, jagged edge of an adrenaline dump. "Keep your hands exactly where I can see them." David didn't flinch. He didn't throw his hands into the air in a panic, and he didn't freeze. Decades of managing catastrophic logistical failures and volatile labor disputes on massive construction sites had burned the panic response out of his system. Slowly, with exaggerated deliberate caution, he lowered his left arm. He kept both hands in plain view against the backdrop of his stained, sweat-ringed Henley. In his right hand, gripped between 2 calloused fingers, the thick leather key fob dangled next to his thigh. "Evening, officer," David said. His voice was steady and flat, entirely missing the nervous pitch Wilson was trained to listen for. "This is my vehicle. I just finished a shift on the site." Wilson closed the distance, his tactical boots crunching loudly over the loose gravel and concrete debris that had blown onto the VIP tier. He stopped exactly 10 feet away. Under the harsh halogen light tower, Wilson's eyes swept rapidly over the man standing in front of him. He took in the caked steel-toed boots, the layer of cement dust on the cheap Henley, and the scratched plastic hard hat. "Right," Wilson sneered. His tone dropped the rigid volume, replaced by a cold, condescending edge. "A guy rolling around in the dirt all day, driving a 150 grand Escalade. Put the keys on the hood and back slowly away from the door. Do it now." David remained perfectly still. He didn't argue the point. He didn't raise his voice to demand the officer's badge number. He simply shifted his right thumb over the smooth, rubberized surface of the fob and pressed a single button. The Escalade responded instantly. A sharp digital chirp echoed across the empty concrete. The massive side mirrors smoothly folded inward with a quiet hum, and the door locks engaged with a solid, echoing metallic thud. The amber parking lights flashed twice, casting a brief warm glow over the standoff. Silence fell over the parking tier, broken only by the low, rumbling idle of the police cruiser's engine. Wilson stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened beneath his collar. His eyes darted from the flashing amber lights of the luxury SUV back to the dusty, exhausted man holding the key. "Those things can be cloned," Wilson snapped. He took a hard step forward, his duty belt creaking loudly. His voice spiked again, defensive and sharp. "I told you to step away from the car. Do you have a state-issued ID on you?" David looked at the young officer. His expression, previously neutral, hardened into a mask of cold, professional patience. He let out a slow, quiet breath through his nose. "My wallet is inside the center console," David replied quietly. To retrieve his identification, David made a slow, entirely natural movement. He shifted his weight onto his left boot and turned his right shoulder back toward the driver's side door, his hand moving toward the matte black handle. Wilson didn't see a man reaching for a driver's license. He saw a suspect making a sudden, unauthorized move toward the dark, unsearched interior of the Escalade. "I said step back," Wilson roared. His right thumb slammed down on the retention hood of his holster with a loud, sharp click. Before David's fingers could even brush the chrome trim of the door handle, Wilson lunged forward, closing the final gap with violent intent. Wilson didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. Fueled by the adrenaline of a perceived threat, he used his momentum and his body weight as a blunt instrument. He crossed the remaining distance in a fraction of a second. Before David's fingers could graze the Escalade's door handle, Wilson's thick tactical glove clamped viciously down on David's right wrist. Wilson twisted the wrist outward, wrenching the arm away from the vehicle. With his other hand, the officer grabbed a fistful of the neon yellow safety vest and the sweaty Henley underneath, at the back of David's neck. "Do not reach into that vehicle," Wilson roared. Using the kinetic force of his lunge, Wilson drove his shoulder directly into David's back. David was a large man, built by decades of physical labor before he ever stepped into a boardroom, but he was completely off balance. The impact drove him violently forward. He slammed chest first onto the broad, flat expanse of the Escalade's matte black hood. The scratched white hard hat slipped from his left hand. It bounced off the luxury SUV's chrome grille and clattered loudly across the pavement, rolling into the dark shadow of the police cruiser. The collision knocked the wind out of David. His right cheek pressed hard against the cold, pristine metal of his own car. A cloud of fine, pale gray cement dust erupted from his work clothes upon impact, instantly smearing the flawless black paint. "Hands behind your back! Stop resisting!" Wilson yelled, his volume echoing off the steel framework of the medical center. David didn't fight back. He didn't tense his shoulders to push off the hood. Knowing exactly how these encounters spiraled into fatal errors, he let his body go entirely limp. He allowed his right arm to be pulled awkwardly upward toward his shoulder blades. "I am not resisting, officer," David said, his voice muffled against the hood. He fought to keep his breathing steady. "You are making a mistake. Shut your mouth!" Wilson shoved his forearm down hard onto the base of David's neck, pinning him flush against the vehicle. Wilson grabbed David's left wrist, yanking it back to meet the right. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit sharply into David's skin. The ratcheting mechanism clicked in rapid, unforgiving succession, locking tight over the thick bones of his wrists. Wilson took a half step back, keeping one hand firmly planted between David's shoulder blades to maintain physical dominance. The violent motion stopped. The only sounds left in the staging area were Wilson's rapid, adrenaline-fueled breathing and the low hum of the cruiser's engine. David lay pinned against the hood, His dusty clothes had left a wide, messy streak of industrial grime across the $150,000 finish. His hands were bound tightly behind his back. "Do you have any weapons, needles, or anything that's going to stick me?" Wilson demanded, his free hand moving to aggressively pat down the outside of David's dusty Carhartt jeans. "No," David replied coldly. He didn't blink as the strobe of the red and blue lights washed over his face. "But if you open that car door without a warrant, this stops being a misunderstanding." Wilson finished his pat-down, his hands moving roughly over the heavy denim of David's work jeans. Finding no weapons, the officer grabbed the short steel chain, linking the handcuffs, and hauled David backward, pulling him off the matte black hood of the Escalade. David stumbled slightly as his boots hit the pavement, but quickly caught his balance. He stood with his back pressed against the front quarter panel of the luxury SUV. A thick smear of pale gray cement dust covered his right cheekbone, where it had ground against the metal. He was breathing heavily, but his dark eyes remained locked on the officer. The heavy leather key fob rested near the windshield wiper, where it had slid during the takedown. Wilson snatched the fob off the hood. He turned toward the driver's side door, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. "Officer," David said, his voice cut through the strobing red and blue lights, sharp and perfectly enunciated. "I am securely detained. The scene is static. I explicitly do not consent to a search of that vehicle." Wilson paused, his hand hovering over the Escalade's matte black door handle. He looked back at David, his jaw muscles flexing beneath his skin. The calm, authoritative tone of the dusty laborer infuriated him. It didn't match the profile of a cornered car thief. Wilson squared his shoulders slightly. He knew the microphone on his chest-mounted Axon body camera was recording every breath. He needed the legal framework on tape before he breached the interior. "Subject is detained on suspicion of grand theft auto," Wilson stated loudly, addressing the camera rather than the man bleeding onto his bumper. Prior to detention, the subject made a sudden, unprovoked lunge toward the driver's side door. "I am entering the vehicle to secure the immediate control area for officer safety and to locate registration to identify the actual owner. I am handcuffed and physically removed from the vehicle," David countered smoothly, refusing to let the false narrative stand unchallenged on the recording. "There is no lunge area. You have no exigent circumstances, and you lack a warrant. If you open that door, you are violating the Fourth Amendment." "You don't dictate the scene to me," Wilson barked, losing his manufactured composure. "You're a suspect in cuffs. Keep your mouth shut." Wilson pressed the unlock button on the fob. The Escalade chirped twice. He pulled the heavy handle. The door swung open, releasing a wave of climate-controlled air that smelled distinctly of premium leather and expensive cologne. The massive digital dashboard illuminated the cabin with a soft, ambient glow, highlighting the pristine, untouched interior. The contrast between the immaculate cabin and the dust-caked man standing in handcuffs outside was absolute. Officer Wilson leaned awkwardly across the driver's seat, his duty belt scraping against the Escalade's steering wheel. The cabin was dead quiet, insulated by thick acoustic glass. The air conditioning was still running, pushing a steady stream of cold air against his face. He bypassed the floorboards. He ignored the space under the seats where a weapon would logically be stashed. He went straight for the center console. He pressed the brushed aluminum release button. The padded lid sprang open with a smooth, hydraulic hiss. Wilson clicked the activation switch on his shoulder-mounted flashlight. A harsh beam of white LED light pierced the ambient glow of the cabin, illuminating the deep storage compartment. There were no screwdrivers, no shaved keys, no signal relay devices. Resting at the bottom of the compartment was a scuffed brown leather bifold wallet. Next to it lay a clear plastic ID sleeve attached to a heavy-duty retractable lanyard. Wilson snatched the wallet first. His tactical gloves made it clumsy to open. He flipped it apart, his flashlight beam reflecting off the plastic window inside. He pulled the card free, holding it up to the light. The high-definition DMV photograph showed a clean-shaven man in a tailored charcoal suit. The man in the photo had the exact same bone structure, the same dark eyes, and the same square jaw as the dust-covered laborer currently bleeding onto the hood of the SUV. Wilson's thumb rubbed over the raised, tactile lettering of the name, David Clark. Wilson dropped the wallet onto the passenger seat and reached across the cabin to pop the glove box. He pulled a neatly folded state registration document from a leather folio. He snapped it open with one hand, shining his light directly onto the top line. Registered owner, Clark Construction Group, Inc., Commercial Fleet / Executive Class. Wilson stared at the black ink. Clark. He looked back down at the driver's license resting on the seat. David Clark. He looked at the registration. Clark Construction. His breathing slowed. He dropped the registration paper and reached back into the open center console. Grabbing the clear plastic ID sleeve attached to the lanyard, he pulled it into the light. It was an all-access general contractor site pass. It bore the official seal of the city's municipal zoning board. Above a secondary photograph of David Clark, printed in bold red block lettering, was a title. David Clark, Chief Executive Officer, Project Lead, Valley Medical Center. Wilson stopped moving. He stood frozen, half inside the SUV, the plastic site badge gripped tightly in his gloved hand. Outside, the red and blue strobes of his cruiser continued to flash violently across the broken asphalt. Slowly, mechanically, Wilson backed out of the Escalade's cabin. He stood up straight, the cold night air hitting the sweat on his neck. He looked at the man he had just tackled. David Clark was still standing perfectly still, his back pressed against the front quarter panel of the Escalade. His hands were locked tightly behind him in steel cuffs. The thick layer of pale gray cement dust on his clothes caught the police lights with every rotation. The small laceration on his cheekbone had stopped bleeding, leaving a dark, dried streak against his skin. David didn't yell. He didn't demand badge numbers or threaten a lawsuit. He simply stood against the fender, his dark eyes locked onto Wilson, waiting in absolute silence. Wilson's gloved hand hovered over the microphone, clipped to his left shoulder. He pressed the transmit button. The radio hissed with a sharp burst of static. "Dispatch," Wilson said. His voice was thin, barely carrying over the idle of the cruiser's engine. "Run a 2729 on a David Clark, Charlie Lima, Alfa Romeo Kilo." The radio on Wilson's shoulder hissed, emitting a short digital tone. "Unit 4, Bravo, copy. Stand by for return on Clark, David." Wilson stood next to the open door of the Escalade, the plastic site badge still gripped in his gloved hand. He didn't look at the man handcuffed against the fender. He stared at the cracked asphalt between his own tactical boots. The seconds stretched. The idle of the cruiser's engine rumbled in the cold air. The thick layer of pale gray dust on David's Carhartt jeans caught the strobe of the red and blue light bars. David didn't shift his weight. He didn't speak. The radio cracked open again. "Unit 4, Bravo, dispatch." The female dispatcher's voice had shifted. The flat mechanical boredom of the night shift was entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, highly controlled professional cadence. Wilson pressed the transmit button on his shoulder mic. His thumb slipped slightly on the plastic casing. "Go ahead, dispatch. Subject is valid, clear of warrants. License is Class C, status valid." A brief, heavy pause hung over the open frequency. "Be advised, Unit 4, Bravo. The subject's profile carries a municipal contact flag. Are you reading me?" Wilson swallowed. The collar of his dark uniform felt suddenly tight against his throat. He keyed the mic. "Copy. Go ahead with the flag. Subject is listed as David Clark, Chief Executive Officer of Clark Construction Group. They are the registered primary contractor for the Valley Medical site." The dispatcher paused again, the static humming in the background. "System also shows a high-priority administrative flag. Subject is a current board member and primary donor for the 4th Precinct Benevolent Association." The words echoed out of the small shoulder speaker, loud and perfectly clear in the quiet parking tier. "Unit 4, Bravo," the dispatcher continued, her voice dropping into a cautious, probing tone. "Watch Commander is requesting your current disposition. Are you out with Mr. Clark? Is the subject currently detained?" Wilson didn't press the transmit button. He slowly lowered his hand from his shoulder. He looked up. David Clark was still leaning against the front quarter panel of the matte black SUV. His wrists were bound tightly behind his back in ratcheting steel cuffs. The jagged laceration on his cheekbone was fully exposed to the harsh glare of the halogen light tower, the dried blood standing out against the pale cement dust coating his face. Wilson looked down at his own chest. The square black casing of his Axon body camera sat firmly in the center of his uniform. The wide-angle lens was pointed directly at the bleeding man standing by the bumper. The small circular LED ring around the lens was glowing solid red, confirming it was actively recording. "Unit 4, Bravo, dispatch," the radio hissed again, a hard edge of urgency bleeding through the static. "I need your disposition. Do you need a supervisor rolling to your location?" Wilson stood completely motionless in the cold air, the plastic sight badge cutting into his palm. 10 seconds of dead air passed. Wilson couldn't formulate a response. The plastic sight badge cut sharply into his palm. The radio clicked open again, the dispatcher taking control of the silence. "Unit 4, Bravo, you are unresponsive. Be advised, Watch Commander is now en route to your location." Wilson didn't reach for his mic to argue. He just stared at the cracked asphalt. The sound of boots crunching on gravel broke the standoff. Out of the deep shadows of the Phase 2 zone, 2 men walked into the harsh glare of the halogen light tower. One was Stan, the older night shift security guard. The other was a younger man wearing a clean white hard hat and a high-visibility jacket. The younger man held a smartphone chest high. The screen glowed in the dark, the camera lens pointed squarely at Officer Wilson and the flashing police cruiser. Wilson's training kicked in, a hollow defensive reflex. He dropped his hand to his duty belt and squared his shoulders. "Step back!" Wilson ordered, his voice echoing off the steel framework of the medical center. It lacked the jagged, adrenaline-fueled bark from 5 minutes ago. "This is an active scene. Return behind the perimeter barricades." The 2 men didn't retreat. They stopped exactly at the edge of the VIP tier, resting against the orange water-filled barricades. "I'm the site superintendent," the younger man said loudly, keeping his phone raised and perfectly steady. "And you have the chief executive of this project bleeding on the hood of his own car." Wilson looked from the glowing screen of the smartphone to the plastic sight badge still gripped in his own gloved hand. Stan stepped forward slightly, pointing a thick finger upward. "Officer," the guard said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I've got the primary PTZ camera locked dead on your position. It's recording everything." Wilson slowly raised his head. High above the chain-link fence, the dark dome of the commercial security camera was angled downward, its red LED piercing the darkness. Every angle of the encounter, from the initial curb jump to the breach of the escalade's interior, was actively being recorded. David Clark hadn't spoken since the search began. He finally shifted his weight, pulling his bruised cheek off the cold, matte black quarter panel. "Stan," David said. His voice was quiet and steady. "Yes, Mr. Clark," the guard answered instantly. "Call Marcus in legal," David instructed, staring directly at Wilson. "Tell him I have been physically assaulted, detained without probable cause, and my vehicle has been searched without a warrant." "Already dialing, Mr. Clark," the superintendent added, his thumb tapping the screen of his phone without lowering the camera. Wilson looked at the open door of the $150,000 SUV. The cold air was pouring into the pristine leather interior. The brown wallet and the state registration document were scattered haphazardly across the passenger seat, exactly where he had dropped them. The radio on Wilson's shoulder clicked open one more time. "Unit 4, Bravo." The dispatcher's voice was stripped of patience. "Watch Commander is 3 minutes out. Confirm your scene is secure." Wilson slowly unclipped the radio from his shoulder. His thumb hovered over the transmit button for a long, heavy second. "Dispatch, 4 Bravo," Wilson replied, his voice flat and hollow. "Hey, stand by." The 3 minutes it took for the watch commander to arrive felt completely devoid of time. A white Ford Police Interceptor SUV turned onto the access road. It didn't use its siren, and its light bar was dark, but the heavy V6 engine roared as it accelerated toward the VIP tier. The SUV braked sharply, angling itself next to Wilson's cruiser, effectively boxing in the scene. The driver's side door opened. Sergeant Hayes stepped out onto the asphalt. He was a 20-year veteran with deep lines cut into the corners of his eyes and silver hair clipping the edge of his collar. Hayes didn't immediately approach. Standing by the open door of his SUV, his eyes executed a rapid, clinical sweep of the staging area. He saw the 2 construction workers leaning against the water barricades, the younger one holding a glowing smartphone squarely in their direction. He followed the security guard's line of sight upward, noting the red recording LED of the commercial PTZ camera mounted on the perimeter pole. He looked at the matte black Escalade, its driver's side door hanging wide open, the pristine interior exposed to the cold air. Finally, his eyes locked onto the 2 men standing in the center of the halogen glare. He saw his patrolman, Officer Wilson. standing rigidly with a heavy plastic ID badge gripped in his hand. And he saw the suspect, a large man covered in pale gray cement dust, bleeding from a jagged laceration on his cheekbone, his wrists locked behind his back in steel handcuffs. Hayes closed the door of his SUV and walked onto the tier. His heavy boots made almost no sound on the pavement. "Wilson," Hayes said. His voice was low, carrying the dangerous, quiet authority of a man who spent his life managing volatile liabilities. "Give me your disposition." Wilson opened his mouth, but his throat worked dryly. He didn't try to recite the Academy standard justification about officer safety or sudden movements. Instead, he simply extended his gloved hand, offering the plastic sight badge to his supervisor. Hayes took the badge. He angled it toward the beam of the halogen light tower. He read the name, David Clark. He read the title, Chief Executive Officer. He looked at the municipal zoning seal stamped in the corner. Hayes slowly lowered the badge. He looked up at the man leaning against the escalade. He took in the heavy-duty Carhartt jeans, the scuffed steel-toed boots, and the dark, dried streak of blood cutting across the dust on the man's face. Hayes didn't ask Wilson for his probable cause. He didn't ask why the suspect was bleeding. He looked directly at Wilson's chest, confirming the Axon body camera was glowing red and recording audio. "Take the cuffs off," Hayes ordered. Wilson stiffened. "Sergeant, the subject—" "I said take the handcuffs off him, right now," Hayes interrupted. The command was absolute, leaving zero room for interpretation. Wilson swallowed hard. He stepped behind David, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the small black handcuff key. He inserted it into the dual keyholes. The heavy steel jaws disengaged with two sharp, metallic clicks. Wilson pulled the cuffs away, letting them dangle from his fingers. David brought his arms forward. Deep, angry red indentations circled both of his wrists. The skin violently chafed from where his weight had pulled against the steel during the takedown. He didn't rub his wrists. He didn't stretch his shoulders or massage the bruised cheekbone where his face had slammed into the Escalade's hood. David slowly turned around. He ignored Wilson entirely, stepping past the young patrolman to face the sergeant directly. "Sergeant," David said. His deep baritone voice was perfectly level, echoing in the cold air. "I am requesting an immediate, time-stamped preservation order on Officer Wilson's body camera footage, your cruiser's dash cam, and the complete dispatch audio logs for the last 20 minutes. Hayes held David's gaze. The veteran supervisor recognized the exact phrasing. It wasn't the angry rant of a street suspect. It was the surgical, preliminary strike of a catastrophic civil rights lawsuit. "Mr. Clark," Hayes replied, his tone shifting into a carefully calibrated mask of professional damage control. "Do you require an EMT for that laceration?" "No," David stated coldly. He reached out, palm up. "I require my identification badge, Sergeant, and I want to know if I am still being detained under suspicion of grand theft auto." Sergeant Hayes did not break eye contact. He slowly extended his right hand, returning the plastic sight badge to David. "You are not detained, Mr. Clark," Hayes said, his tone carefully neutral, entirely stripped of any tactical edge. "You are free to leave the scene." David took the lanyard. He didn't put it in his pocket. He let it hang from his calloused fingers. "I am not leaving yet," David replied. He turned his head, the halogen light catching the dried blood on his cheekbone, and locked his eyes on Officer Wilson. Wilson was still standing next to the cruiser, the empty steel handcuffs dangling uselessly from his black tactical gloves. "Officer," David said. The word wasn't a question. It was a summons. Wilson stiffened. His posture was rigid, but the manufactured authority was completely gone. "Sir?" "Your name and badge number." Wilson's jaw worked. He glanced at Hayes, but the sergeant offered no cover. The veteran supervisor stood perfectly still, his hands resting on his duty belt, watching his patrolman face the consequences of a catastrophic constitutional failure. "Wilson," the officer said, his voice tight, barely carrying over the rumble of the idling engines. "Badge 4092. 4092, David repeated slowly. The deep baritone of his voice etched the numbers permanently into the audio track of the active body cameras. He shifted his gaze back to the supervisor. "And yours, Sergeant?" "Sergeant Hayes, badge 117. Hayes paused. His trained instinct for de-escalation, honed over 2 decades on the street, kicked in. Mr. Clark, I want to assure you that there has been a significant misinterpretation of the circumstances regarding— Stop, David cut him off. He didn't raise his voice, but the absolute cold authority in the single syllable killed the sergeant's sentence instantly. Do not insult my intelligence, Sergeant Hayes, David said evenly. There was no misinterpretation. There was an illegal detention, a physical battery, and a warrantless search of a private vehicle. The footage will speak for itself. Hayes closed his mouth. He nodded once, a subtle, grim acknowledgement of the reality. The trap was sealed, and any further attempt to mitigate it on camera would only fuel the inevitable lawsuit. David turned away from the officers. He walked toward the open driver's side door of the Escalade. His steel-toed boots crunched rhythmically on the loose gravel. He didn't inspect the pristine leather seats. He leaned into the cold cabin, reached across the center console, and picked up his scuffed brown wallet from the passenger seat. He slid it into his back pocket. He picked up the state registration document, folded it along its original crease, and placed it back into the glove compartment, clicking the latch shut. He stepped back and closed the heavy driver's side door. The acoustic glass sealed the cabin with a solid, echoing thud. Instead of walking around to the driver's seat, David moved to the front of the vehicle. He stood before the massive, blacked-out chrome grille. Wilson and Hayes watched him in silence. David looked down at the matte black hood. The flawless finish of the luxury SUV was completely ruined. A wide, chaotic smear of pale gray cement dust stretched across the metal, marking the exact, violent trajectory of the takedown. Near the center of the hood, right where his face had been pinned, several dark, distinct drops of blood had dried against the paint. David didn't try to wipe the dust away. He didn't touch the metal. He simply stared at the physical evidence of his assault for a long, deliberate moment, letting the police body cameras document his ruined property. Then, he looked back at the two officers. "Stan!" David called out, his voice carrying easily toward the perimeter barricades. "Still recording, Mr. Clark," the security guard rasped from the shadows. The screen of the superintendent's phone was still glowing brightly next to him. "Good," David said. He looked directly at Hayes. "Sergeant, I strongly suggest you secure your patrolman before he costs this city more than he already has tonight." David didn't wait for a response. He walked back to the driver's door, pulled the handle, and stepped up into the cabin. He didn't slam the door in anger. He shut it with precise, controlled force. The massive V8 engine of the Escalade fired up with a deep, throaty rumble. The LED headlights swept across the concrete, momentarily blinding the two officers in the harsh white beam. David didn't accelerate aggressively. He shifted the SUV into drive and rolled forward at a slow, meticulous crawl. The heavy tires rolled smoothly over the broken asphalt as he exited the VIP tier, leaving Wilson and Hayes standing perfectly still in the settling dust. The fluorescent lights of the 4th Precinct captain's office hummed with a low, sterile vibration. Captain Miller sat behind his heavy oak desk. The pale glow of his computer monitor washed over his face. He was watching the uploaded Axon body camera footage. The audio was turned down low, but the sound of the takedown, the violent, heavy thud of a body hitting the matte black hood of the Escalade, was unmistakable in the quiet room. Officer Wilson stood at attention in front of the desk. His posture was rigid, but his eyes were fixed on a small scratch in the wood grain of the desk. The heavy door of the office swung open. David Clark walked in. He hadn't gone home. He hadn't showered. He hadn't changed into a tailored charcoal suit to leverage his corporate status. He was exactly as he had been on the staging area. He wore the same cement-dusted Carhartt jeans and the mud-caked steel-toed boots. The stained high-visibility vest hung over his sweat-ringed Henley. The jagged laceration on his cheekbone was dark with dried blood. Every heavy step he took left a faint, pale gray outline of industrial dust on the precinct's polished linoleum floor. Captain Miller immediately reached for his mouse, pausing the video. He stood up. "Mr. Clark," Miller said, his voice carrying the careful, measured tone of a man trying to defuse a bomb that had already detonated. "My watch commander briefed me. I want to assure you." David didn't stop walking until he was standing directly beside Officer Wilson. He didn't look at the captain. He reached into the chest pocket of his vest and pulled out a single, sharply creased legal document. He dropped it flat onto the center of the oak desk. "That is a formal preservation order drafted by my general counsel," David said. His voice was the same steady, flat baritone that the camera had recorded an hour ago. It covers all precinct surveillance, dispatch audio, and body camera data. Tomorrow morning, the city will receive a formal notice of intent to litigate for civil rights violations, battery, and unlawful search. Miller looked down at the document. He didn't touch it. David, if we can discuss this... There is no discussion, Captain. David cut him off smoothly. He finally turned his head to look at the young patrolman standing next to him. Wilson's jaw was locked tight. He stared straight ahead, refusing to meet David's eyes. The adrenaline and aggression from the parking tier were entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, suffocating reality of the room. A badge is a contract, officer, David said quietly. You broke it. David didn't wait for Wilson to speak. He didn't ask for an apology, and he didn't demand the officer's shield. He didn't need to. He simply turned his back on the patrolman and walked toward the door. Wilson slowly raised his right hand to his chest. His fingers, trembling slightly, found the heavy silver shield pinned over his heart. The metal clasp unhooked with a sharp, distinct click. He pulled the badge free and set it down on the edge of the captain's desk, resting it gently against the edge of the legal document. David Clark didn't look back to see it happen. He pushed the door open and walked out into the precinct hallway, the heavy tread of his steel-toed boots echoing rhythmically against the linoleum. Did David go too far by ending a young officer's career over one bad call? Or was this the only way to teach a lesson about power and profiling? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Real power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to wait for the truth to come out. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Case officially closed. For more authentic law enforcement footage, please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for joining Bodycam Incident Reports.